The previous chapter introduced you to how neural signals are generated and transmitted to which structures in the central nervous system. In this chapter, chapter 7, you will learn about the general principles by which sensory information is processed by the sensory system. And in the second half of this chapter, which will be assigned to you in group work, you will learn about the detail about the structure and function of specific sensory systems, particularly on their receptor cells and receptor transduction mechanisms and the pathways by which the sensory information are transmitted in the central nervous system. The sensory system is described as the window of the body to the environment. Technically, the sensory system is defined as the part of the nervous system that processes sensory information. It basically is comprised of the sensory receptors, afferent pathways, and sensory cortex and association cortex. The sensory receptors are nerve cells, sensory organs, or they are the nerve endings of afferent neurons that change specific stimuli or energies into graded or receptor potentials that can initiate action potentials and travel into the central nervous system. The afferent pathways are formed by myelinated axons of afferent neurons that relay the sensory signals to the central nervous system. The sensory and association cortex are the specific regions in the central nervous system where specific or general sensory information are analyzed and integrated with other neural informations so that perception of the sensory information can be achieved. General forms of sensory function includes sensory information, sensation, and perception. Sensory information is any signal that originates in an afferent neuron and reaches the brain, whether or not it reaches consciousness. Sensation, on the other hand, is when an individual exposed to a stimulus is aware of the stimulus. That is, the information reaches the person's consciousness. And then perception is when the processed sensation places the sensation in a meaningful perspective. A good example would be when you have experienced a certain pain on your mouth, and as it reaches your consciousness, these sensation, you find out that it comes from your gums or your teeth. So that's sensation. Perception is when you interpret the pain in your teeth as a toothache because of abscess or infection. That's perception of the sensation of pain. Receptors at the level of sensory organ system refers to cell clusters of sensory organs, or nerve endings of afferent neurons that are specialized to detect specific stimulus and convert this stimulus into receptor potentials. These receptors include photoreceptors that are sensitive to light, thermoreceptors that are sensitive to either heat or cold, chemoreceptors that are sensitive to chemicals of taste, smell, or pain, and mechanoreceptors that detect pressure, touch, muscle tension, balance, and sound. Receptors can be classified as either slow adapting or tonic when they respond in persistent or slow decaying receptor potentials during constant stimulus, or they may be fast adapting or phasic receptors when they respond to stimulus at the onset of the stimulus but cease to respond immediately after. When receptors stop responding to subsequent stimuli, the non-response is called adaptation. Some rapidly adapting receptors only initiate potentials at the onset of stimulus, the so-called on response, whereas other receptors respond with a burst of response at the beginning of the stimulus and another response at the removal of the stimulus, the so-called on-off response. It is important to note here that rapidly adapting receptors are important for monitoring sensory stimuli that move or change quickly, like skin vibrations, and those that persist but need no further monitoring, such as pressure of tight clothing. The figures here shows the application of stimulus on the nerve ending or specialized sensory cell that triggers action potentials through the nerve fiber of the either the apparent neuron or the subsequent cell or the postsynaptic cell. In receptors or apparent neurons, the stimulus often trigger graded potentials, which can be summated and which can reach threshold that can trigger action potentials along the apparent fiber. If the stimulus is increased, it also increases the frequency of action potentials that are triggered in the apparent neuron. The more frequent the action potentials are, the more transmitters are released from the axon terminal of the apparent neuron. So the stimulus can therefore be represented, the magnitude or strength of the stimulus can be represented by the frequency of action potentials that are triggered by greater or stronger uh, receptor potentials by the receptor cells. These other figures here shows the slow adapting tonic receptor, such that when it is stimulated at the beginning, it produces receptor potential that do not immediately decay or disappear. Rather, the receptor potentials continue to happen until the stimulus is turned off. So these are the response of receptors that are slowly adapting or toning. In rapidly or fast adapting phasic receptors, the receptor potentials of these rapidly adapting receptors are triggered only very briefly by a stimulus and then dies out. The less the stimulus, the less the strength of the stimulus, the less the frequency of action potentials triggered in fast or rapidly adapting phasic receptors. Coding is the conversion of stimulus energy into a signal that conveys the relevant sensory information to the central nervous system. A single afferent neuron with all its receptor endings make up a sensory unit. The afferent neuron has a single receptor, but generally the peripheral end of an afferent neuron divides into many fine branches, each terminating with a receptor. The area of the body that leads to activity in a particular afferent neuron when stimulated is called the receptive field for that neuron. Receptive fields of neighboring afferent neurons usually overlap so that stimulation of a single point activates several sensory units. Thus, activation of a single sensory unit almost never occurs. Coding of a stimulus may be achieved by the modality or the type of stimulus, or the stimulus intensity, and the location by which the stimulus has been applied. Based on modality or stimulus type, sensory receptors are sensitive only to a particular stimulus. So, if the stimulus is hot or cold, it will stimulate only nerve endings that are sensitive to it. Or if the stimulus is sound, then the hair cells of the inner ear would be stimulated and none other. If it's pressure, it would be the pressure receptors at the skin or at the muscle tendons that detects this. So the stimulus type or modality of the stimulus may be a code for a particular sensory information. The intensity of stimulus can also be used as a code for the stimulus or sensory information. But the question is, how does an afferent neuron distinguish a strong stimulus from a weak one when the information about both stimuli is relayed by action potentials that are all of the same amplitude? One way by which the stimulus intensity is encoded by the afferent neuron is by altering the frequency of firing by the afferent neuron. If the stimulus is strong, then you would have high frequency of receptor firing. If the stimulus is weaker, then you have less receptor firing. Another way is by recruitment of receptors. With stronger stimulus, you would have more receptors that are firing than weak stimuli with less receptors that are recruited to fire. Based on location of the stimulus, coding is by the site of receptor stimulated or along unique pathways called labeled lines. The precision or acuity by which a stimulus may be located and discern it as one stimulus depend on the amount of convergence of neuronal input. The greater the convergence, the less acuity or precision is detected of the stimulus, or the less acutely the sensory stimulus is perceived. Lateral inhibition occurs when afferent neurons at the edge of the stimulus is strongly inhibited,
compared to the activity of the neuron at the center of the uh, receptive field. So usually when this midpoint of the receptive field is stimulated, the central parent neuron will also send signals to the neighboring cells around it to stop or inhibit it from firing, and so you have lateral inhibition. Descending pathways may also influence sensory information relay by directly inhibiting the central terminals of the afferent neuron, which is a presynaptic inhibition, or via interneuron that affects the ascending pathway by inhibitory synapses. The ascending pathways comprise of nerve fibers by which uh, afferent sensory impulses are transmitted to the central nervous system, and which finally end up in specific sensory cortex in the brain. The ascending pathways usually consist of first-order neurons, which are made up of the afferent neurons, and then second-order neurons, which are located in the central nervous system. This comprises of interneurons, which receives the signals from the afferent or sensory neurons. You have two ascending pathways in general. You have specific ascending pathways and non-specific ascending pathways. The specific ascending pathways uh, carry information about single types of stimulus along individual afferent fibers. Somatic receptors, like those in the skin, skeletal muscles and bones, and tendons and joints, uh, usually relay their signals at the contralateral pathway, that is at the opposite side of the brain, and then transmit this to the signals to the somatosensory cortex or sensory cortices. So you have very specific informations that are received from these very specific pathways. And then you have the non-specific ascending pathways, which constitutes of clusters of nerve fibers that are activated by sensory units of several different types of stimuli. These pathways signal general information such as skin pressure, heat or cold to polymodal neurons. This pathway is important to the control of alertness and arousal. The pathway involves the sensory receptors that transmits the signals to the polymodal sensory neurons and then sends these to the brainstem reticular formation, the thalamus, and then finally to the non-specific cerebral cortex. So the kinds of stimulus, or rather the information that they bring, are general informations or non-specific informations along the non-specific ascending pathways. The cortical association areas lie adjacent to the primary sensory and motor cortex. So the region closest to the primary sensory cortex processes information in a very simple way and serve basic sensory related functions. The regions farther from the primary sensory cortex areas process information in more complicated ways, such as combinations of sensory signals to signals from other brain regions serving in arousal, attention, memory, and language. Some neurons of these latter regions also integrate input concerning two or more types of sensory stimuli. Certain factors affect perception, like sensory receptor mechanisms, such as adaptation, can alter perception, and by processing of information along afferent pathways that are very specific for a particular afferent signal. So this can affect perception as well. If the signal or information goes along a different route that do not involve receptors or afferent pathways that are sensitive to such stimulus, then perception may be altered or stop. Emotions and personality and experience and social background can also influence perception. The lack of specific receptors may fail to detect stimuli. The damage in neural pathways, such as the phantom limb, due to activation of central nervous pathways, or the reorganization of the somatosensory cortex, can also affect the perception of sensory stimulus. And finally, drugs. Drugs are also potent influences on perception. Even the simple drowse-inducing drugs such as cold medicine can affect our perception of things, like usually food tastes bland when when you are sleepy, or when you are induced to become sleepy because of drowse-inducing drugs. As your assignment, I would like you to tabulate the specific sensory systems based on the receptors that they possess, giving their names, specific names, and the receptor transduction mechanisms that are involved, as well as the sensory pathways that are taken by the specific sensory information. You have to do this for each of the specific sensory system, like somatosensory, visual, auditory, vestibular, olfactory, and gustatory systems. Um, if the discussion or the uh, write-up of receptor transduction mechanisms in are too many, you can use several pages for the assignment. This is a sample table by which you can tabulate the specific sensory systems according to their receptors, the names of their receptor cells, the receptor transduction mechanisms involved, and the sensory pathways involved. As I said, if the discussion and presentation of the sensory pathways or receptor transduction mechanism is in multiple, um, you can use entire pages or half of the page for a particular specific sensory system. We'll have a quiz later on Friday, August 14, regarding the sensory system, particularly the specific sensory system.